Students, in this episode, we shall discuss about potassium, a major intracellular cation which has a pivotal role in human body. Let us start our discussion with an introduction. Potassium is one of the 7th essential macro minerals along with calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, sodium, chloride and sulfur. We require at least 100 milligrams of potassium daily to support key bodily processes. Potassium's primary function in the body include regulating fluid balance and controlling the electrical activity of the heart and other muscles. Potassium is an electrolyte that counteracts the effects of sodium, helping to maintain a healthy blood pressure. It is also important for maintaining acid-base balance. This episode will be in sections as the information in each sections would supplement each other with the following objectives. That is, after studying this episode, you will be able to understand the distribution of potassium, discuss the absorption and utilization, learn about the food sources and describe the deficiency and toxicity of potassium. Let us get started with the distribution. Potassium is the major intracellular cation. In fact, in contrast to sodium, about 95 to 98% of the body's potassium is found within body cells. Potassium constitutes up to 0.35% of total body weight or up to 245 grams in a 70 kg human. Serum potassium is normal, regulated within a normal range of 3.5 to 5 millimole per liter, 75% of which is in the muscles, 98% is in the intracellular fluid and 2% in the extracellular fluid. 90% of the total potassium is in the exchangeable form while 10% is non-exchangeable form. Erythrocytes contain large amounts of potassium. Serum potassium decreases during increased carbohydrate utilization and aldosterone decreases serum potassium. The mechanism of absorption of potassium. Potassium is readily and completely absorbed from the diet and excrete an equivalent amount of in the urine. Normal fecal potassium excretion averages about 9 milliequivalent per day. Potassium absorption occurs in the small intestine mainly by passive mechanism. The rectum and perhaps the sigmoid colon have the capacity to actively secrete potassium. The mechanisms by which potassium is absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract are not as clearly understood as the mechanisms of sodium absorption. Over 85% of the ingested potassium is absorbed, although the exact sites along the small intestine at which absorption takes place have been precisely identified. In addition to being absorbed in the small intestine, potassium may be absorbed across the colonic mucosal cells. Depending on concentration, potassium is thought to be absorbed by passive diffusion or by potassium hydrogen ion ATPase pump. This pump exchanges intracellular hydrogen ion for luminal potassium. Alternatively, potassium may enter the cell through brush border membrane channels that also serve as secretory pathways. To enter the blood, the potassium accumulated in the intestinal cell diffuses across the basolateral membrane through the potassium channels. Uptake of potassium into non-intestinal cells occurs by active transport. Intracellular potassium concentrations also are maintained by sodium-potassium ATPase pumps, which are stimulated by hormones, especially insulin and catecholamines. Potassium, however, also influences insulin with hypokalemia, reducing insulin secretion. Kidney is primarily responsible for maintaining total body potassium content by matching potassium intake and potassium excretion. Adjustments in renal potassium excretion occur over several hours. Therefore, changes in extracellular potassium concentration are initially buffered by movement of potassium into or out of skeletal muscle. The regulation of potassium distribution between the intracellular and extracellular space is referred to as internal potassium balance. The most key factors regulating this movement under normal conditions are insulin and catecholamines regulate internal potassium distribution, with alpha adrenergic receptors impairing and beta adrenergic receptors promoting cellular entry of potassium. Beta 2 receptor induced stimulation of potassium uptake is mediated by activation of the sodium potassium ATPase pump. Changes in plasma tonicity and acid base disorders also influence internal potassium balance. Hyperglycemia leads to water movement from the intercellular to extracellular compartment. This water movement favors potassium effects from the cell through the process of solvent drag. In addition, cell shrinkage causes intracellular potassium concentration to increase, creating a more favorable concentration gradient for potassium flux. Here are some of the studies on potassium balance in body. An extensive review of the literature of potassium is given, and it is concluded that the element has an essential part in the physicochemical structure of the cell. The element can, however, move freely throughout the body into and out of the cells during periods of change in acid-base equilibrium. During protoplasmic growth, the direction of the movement is into the cell, and during the periods of protoplasmic disintegration of element moves out. In hemorrhage, shock, adrenalectomy, during intraperitoneal injection of glucose, in intestinal obstruction or fistulae, all conditions involving bodily losses of sodium and water, potassium leaves the cells and enters the plasma. Similarly, blood potassium is raised during increased muscular activity and increased rate of metabolism and falls during rest and anesthesia. The plasma potassium varies with the lactic acid level under certain conditions. Under other conditions, it follows the blood sugar trend. Body potassium seems to be under the control of the adrenal glands to some extent, principally the adrenal cortex. The relation of potassium to nerve and muscle functions was examined, and it was shown that it is active and important in synapses and myoneural junctions in small concentrations. It is excitatory and in greater amounts inhibitory. In the subsections, we have seen how potassium is absorbed in the body. Now, let us understand the utilization of potassium in the body. Potassium is a very important mineral for the human body. It influences the contractility of smooth skeletal and cardiac muscle and profoundly affects the excitability of nerve tissue. It is also important in maintaining electrolyte and pH balance. Potassium function includes blood pressure regulation, muscle control, nerve impulse function, heart function, and electrolyte regulation. Another of the pump's most important functions is preventing the swelling of cells. If sodium is not pumped out, water accumulates within the cell, causing it to swell and ultimately burst. Research has found that a high sodium diet with low potassium intake influences vascular volume and tends to elevate the blood pressure. Potassium works with sodium to maintain blood pressure. High potassium levels can relax blood vessel and excrete sodium, which both lowers blood pressure. Potassium plays a role in nerve conduction, specifically through the sodium-potassium pump. In the nerve cells, this sodium-potassium flux generates the electrical potential that aids the conduction of nerve impulses. When potassium leaves the cell, it changes the membrane potential and allows the nerve impulses to progress. This electrical potential gradient created by the sodium-potassium pump helps generate muscle contractions and regulates the heartbeat. Potassium also functions to maintain pH levels. The amount of hydrogen in the extracellular fluid is low during alkalosis, so the cells will release hydrogen to increase acidity. As a result, blood serum potassium is absorbed and its level drops. Potassium can help regulate water retention as well. Potassium is able to combat sodium's effect since consuming more potassium causes sodium to be removed from the body through urine. Potassium is very important in cellular biochemical reactions and energy metabolism. It participates in the synthesis of protein from amino acids in the cell. Potassium also functions in carbohydrate metabolism. It is active in glycogen and glucose metabolism, converting glucose to glycogen that can be stored in the liver for future energy. Potassium is important for normal growth and for building muscle. Body fluid is composed of water and electrolytes. Water dissolves and transports substances, account for blood volume, maintain blood pressure, protect and lubricate tissues. Electrolytes such as potassium, sodium, chloride, phosphorus, etc. form ions when dissolved in water and can carry an electrical current. The electrical charge acts as a spark that stimulates nerves and causes muscles to contract. Potassium and phosphate are dominant in the intracellular fluid and sodium and chlorine in the extracellular fluid. The occurrence of these electrolytes on either side of the cell membrane creates a difference in electrical charge, and this is needed for the cell to perform its normal functions. Cells regulate the balance of fluids between internal and external environment by using special transport proteins that actively pump potassium and sodium across cell membranes. To summarize the utilization of potassium in human body, your body needs potassium to build proteins, break down and use carbohydrates, build muscles, maintain normal body growth, control the electrical activity of the heart, control the acid-base balance, cellular volume maintenance, intracellular pH regulation, neuromuscular excitability, and cardiac pacemaker rhythmicity. Now we shall look at the excretion of potassium from the body. Potassium is normally eliminated in urine and a small amount in feces. Aldosterone influences potassium excretion. Up to 90% of potassium is excreted from the body by the kidneys, with only lesser amounts excreted in the feces. As with sodium, potassium balance is achieved largely through the kidneys, with aldosterone being the major regulatory hormone. Aldosterone acts reciprocally on sodium and potassium. Although it stimulates the reabsorption of sodium in the kidney tubules, aldosterone accelerates the excretion of potassium. Potassium is readily and completely absorbed from the diet and excreted in equal amount of the urine. Normal fecal potassium excretion averages about 9 milliequivalent per day. Agrawal et al. In 1994 demonstrated that hyperaldosteronism increases fecal potassium excretion by about 3 milliequivalent per day in people with otherwise normal intestinal tracts. Cation exchange renin by mouth can increase fecal potassium excretion to 40 milliequivalent per day. The absorptive mechanism of potassium are not disturbed by diarrhea per se, but fecal potassium losses are increased in diarrheal diseases by unabsorbed ions, by electrochemical gradients secondary to active chloride secretion, and probably by secondary hyperaldosteronism. In diarrhea, total body potassium can be reduced by two mechanisms: loss of muscle mass because of malnutrition and reduced net absorption of potassium. Only the latter causes hypokalemia. Balanced studies in patients with diarrhea emphasize a vital role for dietary potassium intake, renal potassium excretion, and fecal potassium losses in determining whether a patient develops hypokalemia. Now let us identify the dietary sources of potassium. Food sources. Potassium is widely spread in the diet and is especially abundant in unprocessed foods, which provide potassium along with ions like phosphate and citrate. Foods exceptionally rich in potassium include fruits such as prune juice, bananas, mango, papaya, and vegetables like green leafy vegetables, yam, etc. The other good sources of potassium are legumes, nuts and seeds, peanuts, butter, potatoes, mushroom, orange juice, grape juice, peaches, pears, kiwi, milk and yogurt. In addition to unprocessed sources, salt substitutes often contain potassium in place of sodium. Dried apricots contain more potassium than fresh apricots. Soya products are also good sources of potassium. Growth retardation is seen in children with depletion of potassium. The individual becomes excessively fragile and kidney hypertrophy is exhibited. Hypokalemia is associated with cardiac muscular weakness, nervous irritability, hypercalciuria, glucose intolerance and mental disorientation, and can result from profound fluid loss such as the losses that occur with severe vomiting and diarrhea or with use of some diuretic medications. Hypokalemia also may occur as part of refeeding syndrome, which occurs when malnourished people are being refed through intravenously. Growth retardation is seen in children with depletion of potassium. The individual becomes excessively fragile and kidney hypertrophy is exhibited. Hypokalemia is associated with cardiac muscular weakness, nervous irritability, hypercalciuria, glucose intolerance and mental disorientation, and can result from profound fluid loss such as the losses that occur with severe vomiting and diarrhea or with use of some diuretic medications. Hypokalemia also may occur as part of refeeding syndrome, which occurs when malnourished people are being refed through intravenously. A moderate deficiency of potassium is associated with elevations in blood pressure, increased urinary calcium excretion, and abnormal bone turnover. Potassium deficiency occurs in chronic wasting diseases like malnutrition, prolonged negative nitrogen balance, gastrointestinal losses, and metabolic alkalosis. Hyperkalemia is increased level of serum potassium, and this occurs in Addison's disease, advanced chronic renal failure, shock, and dehydration. Toxicity disease or symptoms include dilation of the heart, cardiac arrest, small bowel ulcers. Hyperkalemia occurs in patients with renal failure, severe dehydration, Addison's disease due to decreased excretion of potassium by kidney. In this episode, we learnt about potassium, its absorption and utilization. We identified the dietary sources and discussed about excretion, described the deficiency as well as toxicity. Now let us summarize today's episode. Potassium is a principal cation in intracellular fluid and functions in acid-base balance. Regulation of osmotic pressure, conduction of nerve impulse, muscle contraction, particularly the cardiac muscle, cell membrane function, and sodium-potassium ATPase. Potassium is also required during glycogenesis. It also helps in transfer of phosphate from ATPase to pyruvic acid and probably has a role in many other basic cellular enzymatic reactions. Its metabolism is regulated by aldosterone. Hypokalemia is low level of serum potassium and hyperkalemia is increased level in serum potassium. Thank you. I hope that you understood today's episode. Thank you once again.